Today we will learn the 8 most common signs and symptoms of a failing starter. To start, the starter is an electric motor that jump-starts the engine by providing the torque needed to get it going. It connects to the flywheel, which then rotates the crankshaft, starting the engine. You'll typically find the starter near the engine's flywheel or flex plate. When spotting signs of a failing starter motor, it's easy to confuse them with symptoms of a battery or alternator problem. Throughout this video, we'll provide some tips on how to differentiate between issues with the starter, alternator, or battery. Now, let's start talking about the most common symptoms of a failing starter. Number 1. No crank, no start, or weak crank symptom. One of the most common symptoms associated with a faulty starter is the engine's failure to crank or start. This typically starts from an internal electrical problem, such as a malfunctioning starter solenoid or worn-out brushes within the starter. When these components fail, they are unable to conduct current through the commutator to initiate the starter's rotation. Usually, when the starter goes bad, you'll be staring at a frustrating no crank, no start situation. However, sometimes the starter might be acting up gradually, and you might experience a feeble attempt at cranking, and the engine might still manage to start up. If the starter can muster up enough power to get the engine going, you can get back on the road. To help you start your car, have someone give the starter a gentle tap with a dead blow hammer while you turn the key. Sometimes this can jostle the brushes inside the starter, which can improve the contact with the commutator. If you're lucky, this can allow current to flow through, spinning the starter and getting your engine to crank. Number 2, slow crank when starting. This issue could come from inadequate contact between the brush and the commutator. This poor connection delays the flow of the necessary current required to generate the motor's full torque, which is why it prevents its ability to effectively turn the engine. If you're facing this situation, it's best to address it immediately. One solution is to have a professional inspect and potentially replace the starter motor to ensure proper functionality. Ignoring this could only lead to further complications or complete failure of the starter that can leave you stranded. Number 3. One-click clicking sounds. When you attempt to start the engine and hear only a single click sound, it's likely the solenoid activating the plunger to extend the pinion gear that made contact with the flywheel. However, if the starter fails to turn, the reason might be an electrical malfunction within the starter itself. Meanwhile, if you're hearing rapid, repeated clicking when you turn the key or press the start button, it's often another indication of a problem with the starter motor. This clicking noise is produced by the solenoid, typically connected directly to the starter because it's attempting to engage the starter motor, but the starter itself is failing to operate. Then if you're not hearing any rapid clicking or any sounds at all, it's a problem specifically with the starter solenoid since it's responsible for producing the clicking noise. So if there's silence when you attempt to start the engine, it suggests an issue with the solenoid rather than the starter motor itself. However, it's important to recognize that both components are interconnected and contribute to the starting process. Number 4. Hearing the starter running but not the engine. If you notice the starter free spinning, it means that while the starter is activated, the pinion gear isn't extending to engage with the flywheel or flex plate, thus failing to initiate the engine's rotation. If you encounter the starter free spinning without engaging the flywheel or flex plate, check for any visible obstructions or damage around the starter assembly. If none are found, the problem likely lies within the starter mechanism itself. In this case, it's advisable to have a mechanic inspect and potentially replace the starter to restore proper functionality and prevent further damage to the engine components. If you delay it, it could lead to more severe issues and potential vehicle breakdowns. Number 5. Hearing a grinding noise while cranking. The cause of this issue may start from a damaged pinion gear within the starter mechanism. When faulty, it can produce a noticeable grinding noise when attempting to engage with the flywheel or flex plate. Before determining that the starter is at fault, try to verify the condition of the battery as well and ensure that all connections are clean and free from corrosion. Issues with the battery or poor connections can sometimes mimic symptoms of a faulty starter. Number 6. Smoke or electrical burning smells. As we mentioned earlier, when you turn the ignition to start the vehicle, the starter demands a large dose of power and voltage from the battery. If there's a glitch with the starter, it can lead to overheating in the electrical system, especially if you keep trying to start the vehicle repeatedly, pumping all that power to the starter. If you encounter this issue, it's important not to attempt to start the vehicle again. Instead, get the problem diagnosed and fixed immediately to prevent further harm to the electrical system. Electrical repairs can quickly escalate, so it's best to fix the issue first. While this may not be a common symptom, it's still important to highlight the potential severity of overheating the electrical system, since it can lead to significant and costly damage. Number 7. No electrical problem. When everything seems to be in top shape with your car's electrical system. Dashboard lights shining bright, headlights beaming, radio humming, and windows gliding smoothly. It might seem like smooth sailing. However, if you turn the key or push the start button and nothing happens, it could be a sign of starter failure. Despite all the electronic components functioning flawlessly, the starter failing to engage suggests that the battery has sufficient power for accessories, but not enough to crank the engine. So, what initially appears as smooth sailing can lead back to a hiccup with the starter. While the issue still can be from a battery failure, there are signs to distinguish it from a starter problem. If your car attempts to crank but fails to start the engine, followed by a decline in electronic functionality, it's likely due to the starter drawing excessive power from the battery during the first cranking attempt, causing a rapid drain. You may notice issues with various electrical systems like the radio, windows, headlights, and dashboard lights. But if your electronic accessories continue to function normally for an extended period despite the engine not cranking, it's more indicative of a starter problem rather than a battery or alternator issue. Number 8. Visual cues. If you inspect the area of the starter motor and observe an oily or fluid-coated surface, it could signify the presence of an oil, coolant, or other fluid leak. This leakage might be seeping into the starter motor, potentially causing damage or affecting its performance. In most vehicles, the starter isn't typically positioned in a spot vulnerable to direct drips from oil or coolant leaks. So when you spot fluid residue around the starter area, investigate the source of the leak to prevent any potential issues with the starter motor. And that concludes our discussion on the 8 most common signs and symptoms of starter failure. Again, it's important to note that signs of starter, battery, and alternator failure can often overlap, particularly when it comes to issues like the engine failing to start, crank, or turn over. So it's best to have your car check if you're unsure of the issue you're dealing with. If you find videos like this helpful, make sure to like and subscribe so we can assist you. Fix it.